Chapter 23. Jarl Irak, wolfship captain and member of Ragnak's inner council of senior jarls, had been absent from Hallisholm for several weeks. He was whistling as he strode back through the open gates to the lodge, with a sense of satisfaction over a job well done. Borsa had sent him to sail down the coast to one of the southernmost settlements to inquire over an apparent shortfall in taxes paid by the local jarl. Borsa had noticed a decline over the past 4 or 5 years. Nothing too sudden to be suspicious, but a little less every year. It had taken a calculating mind like Borsa's to notice the creeping discrepancy, and to note that the gradual reduction in reported income had coincided with the election of a new jarl in the village. Smelling a rat, the Hilfman had assigned Irak to investigate, and to persuade the local jarl that honesty, in the case of taxes owed to Ragnak, was definitely the best policy. It has to be admitted that Irak's version of investigating consisted of seizing the unfortunate jarl by his beard as he lay sleeping in the pre-dawn darkness. Irak then threatened to brain him with a battle-axe if he didn't make a rapid and upward adjustment to the amount of tax he was paying to Hallisholm. They were rough and ready tactics, but highly effective. The Jarl was only too eager to hand over the delinquent tax. It was sheer chance that Irak came striding back through the gates at the very moment that Will was stumbling, shovel in hand, to clear the walkways of the deep snow that had fallen overnight. For a moment, Irak didn't recognize the emaciated, shambling figure. But there was something familiar about the shock of brown hair, matted and dirty as it was. Irak stopped for a closer look. "Gods of darkness, boy," he muttered. "Is that you?" The boy turned to look at him, the expression blank and incurious. He was reacting only to the sound of a voice. There was no sign that he recognized the speaker. His eyes were red-rimmed and dull as he regarded the burly Scandian. Irak felt a deep sadness come over him. He knew the signs of wormweed addiction, of course, knew that it was used to control the yard slaves, and he'd seen many of them die from the combined effects of cold, malnutrition, and the general lack of will to live that resulted from addiction to the drug. Wormweed addicts looked forward to nothing, planned for nothing. Consequently, they had no hope to bolster their spirits. It was that, as much as anything, that killed them in the long run. It hurt him to see this boy brought so low, to see those eyes, once so full of courage and determination, reflecting nothing but the dull emptiness of an addict's lack of hope or expectation. Will waited a few seconds, expecting to be given an order. Deep inside him, a faint memory stirred for a second or two. A memory of the face before him and the voice he had heard. Then, the effort of remembering became too great, the fog of addiction too thick, and, with the slightest of shrugs, he turned away and shambled to the gateway to begin shoveling the snow. Within a few minutes, he would be soaked with sweat from the heavy work. Then the moisture would freeze on his body, and the cold would eat deep into him again. He knew the cold now. It was his constant companion, and with the thought of the cold, there came the longing for the next supply of the weed, his next few moments of comfort. Irak watched Will as he bent slowly and clumsily to his task. He swore softly to himself and turned away. Other yard slaves were already at work on the paddles at the fresh water well, smashing the thick ice that had formed during the freezing night. He passed them by quickly, with barely a glance. He was no longer whistling. 2 days later, late in the evening, Evelyn was summoned to Jarl Irak's quarters. She had managed to claim a sleeping space for herself that was close enough to the great ovens to be warm through the night, but not so close that she roasted. Now, at the end of a long day, she spread her blanket out on the hard rushes and sank gratefully onto it, rolling it around her. Her pillow was a small log from the firewood pile, padded with an old shirt. She lay back on it now, listening to the noises of those around her. The occasional thick, chesty coughs that were the inevitable result of living in the snow and ice of Scandia at this time of year, and the low muttering of conversation. This was one of the few times that the slaves were free to talk among themselves. Usually, Evelyn was too tired to take advantage of it. She became conscious of the fact that someone was calling her name, and she sat up with a small groan. A chamber slave was moving through the rows of prone forms, occasionally stooping to shake a shoulder and ask if anyone knew where she would find the Araluen slave called Evelyn. For the most part, she received blank stares and disinterested shrugs. Life among the slaves was not conducive to forming new friendships. "Over here," Evelyn called, and the chamber slave looked to see where the voice came from, then picked her way carefully across the bodies to her. "You're to come with me," she said, a pompous tone in her voice. Chamber slaves, who looked after the living quarters in the lodge, saw themselves as superior beings to mere kitchen slaves, a breed of people who lived in a world of grease and spilt wine and food. "Where?" Evelyn asked, and the girl sniffed disdainfully at her. "Where you're told," she replied. Then, as Evelyn made no move to rise, she was forced to add, "Jarl Irak says." After all, she had no personal authority over kitchen slaves, even though she might think herself above them. The Scandians recognized no such differentiation. A slave was a slave, and, apart from the gang bosses in the yard, they were all the same as each other. There was a small stir of interest from the others sitting and lying nearby. It was not unknown for the senior Scandian officers to recruit their personal slaves from the ranks of the more attractive young girls. Wondering what this was all about, Evelyn rose and carefully folded her blanket, leaving it to mark her space. Then, gesturing for the older girl to lead the way, she followed her out of the kitchen. Ragnak's lodge was, in effect, a veritable rabbit warren of passageways and rooms leading from the central, high-ceilinged great hall where meals were served and official business conducted. The girl led Evelyn now through a series of low, dimly lit passageways until they reached what appeared to be a dead end. There was a door set into the end of the wall, and the chamber slave indicated it to her. "In there," she said briefly, then added, "You'd better knock first." And she turned away, hurrying back down the dim corridor. Evelyn hesitated a moment, not sure what this was all about, then rapped with her knuckles on the hard oak of the door. "Come in." She recognized the voice that answered her knock. Irak's vocal cords were trained to carry to his men over the gales of the storm-white sea. He never seemed to lessen the volume. There was a latch on the outside of the door. She raised it and went inside. Irak's chambers were simple. Inevitably constructed from pine logs, there was a sitting room and, screened by a woven wool curtain, a bedchamber to one side. The sitting room had a small log fire burning at one end, giving the room a comfortable warmth, and several carved oak chairs. A very expensive and, she recognized, foreign tapestry covered the rush floor. She guessed it was the result of one of Irak's raids to Gallica. In her years at Castle Araluen, she had seen many similar pieces. Woven by the artists of the Tiare Valley over a period of years that often spanned 1 or 2 decades, the rugs usually changed hands for a small fortune. Somehow, she didn't think Irak had paid cash for his. The Jarl was sitting by the fire, leaning back in one of the comfortable-looking carved chairs. He motioned her in and indicated a bottle and glasses on a low table in the centre of the room. "Come in, girl. Pour us some wine and sit down. We have some talking to do." Uncertainly, she crossed the room and poured the red wine into 2 glasses. Then, handing one to the Scandian, she sat on the other armchair. Unlike Iraq, however, she didn't sprawl comfortably back. She perched nervously on the edge, as if poised for flight. The Jarl studied her with what appeared to be a hint of sadness in his look. Then he waved a hand at her. "Relax, girl. Nobody's going to harm you, least of all me. Drink your wine." Tentatively, she took a sip and found it surprisingly good. Iraq was watching her, and he saw the involuntary expression of surprise on her face. "You know good wine, then?" he asked her. "I took a hogshead of this out of a Florentine ship in the last raiding season. Not bad, is it?" She nodded her agreement. She was beginning to relax a little, and the wine sent a soft glow through her. She hadn't touched alcohol in any form for months, she realized. The thought occurred to her that she had better watch her step, and her tongue. She waited now for the Scandian captain to speak. He seemed to be hesitating, as if not sure how he should proceed. The silence grew between them until, eventually, she could bear it no longer. She took another quick sip of her wine, then asked, "Why did you send for me?" Jarl Iraq had been staring into the flames of the small fire. He looked up in surprise now as she spoke. He must be unused to having slaves begin conversations with him, she thought. Then she shrugged. They could sit here in silence all night if someone didn't get the ball rolling. She was intrigued to see a slow smile break out on the bearded face. It occurred to her that in another place, under different conditions, she could grow to quite like the Scandian pirate. "Probably not for the reason you're thinking," he said. Then, before she could reply, he continued, almost to himself. "But somebody has to do something, and I think you're the one for the job." "Do something?" Evelyn repeated. "Do something about what?" Iraq seemed to come to a decision then. He heaved a deep sigh, drained the last of the wine in his glass, and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his craggy, bearded face thrust towards her. "Have you seen your friend lately?" he asked. "Young Will." Her eyes dropped from his gaze. She had seen him all right, or rather, she had seen the shambling, mindless figure that he had become. Some days ago, he had been working outside the kitchen and she had taken him some food. He snatched the bread from her hands and devoured it like an animal. But when she spoke to him, he merely stared at her. In 2 short weeks, he had already forgotten Evelyn, forgotten Holt and the little cottage by the edge of the woods outside Castle Redmont. He had forgotten even the major events that had happened at the plains of Uthal, when King Duncan's army had faced and defeated Morgorath's implacable Wargle regiments. Those events, and all the others in his young life, might as well have taken place on the far side of the moon for all he was concerned. Today, his life and his total being centered on one thought and one thought only: his next supply of wormweed. One of the other slaves, an older woman, had witnessed the encounter. As Evelyn returned to the kitchen, she had spoken softly to her. "Forget your friend. The drugs got him. He's already dead." "I've seen him," she told Iraq now in a low voice. "I had nothing to do with that," he said angrily, surprising Evelyn with the intensity of his reply. "Nothing. Believe me, girl, I hate that damned drug. I've seen what it does to people. No one deserves that sort of shadow life." She looked up to meet his gaze again. He was obviously sincere and, equally obviously, wanted her to acknowledge what he had said. She nodded. "I believe you," she said. Iraq rose from his chair. He strode restlessly about the small, warm room as if action, any form of physical action, would relieve the fury that had been building within him since he encountered Will. "A boy like that, he's a real warrior. He may only be knee-high to a gnat, but he's got the heart of a true Scandian." "He's a ranger," she told him quietly, and he nodded. That he is, and he deserves better than this. That damned drug. I don't know why Ragnak allows it. He paused for a long moment, gaining control of his temper. Then he turned to her and continued. I want you to know that I tried to keep you two together. I had no idea Borsa would send him to the yard. That man has no concept of how to treat an honourable enemy. But what can you expect? Borsa's no warrior. He counts sacks of grain for a living. I see, Evelyn said carefully. She wasn't sure that she did, but she felt some response was expected of her. Iraq looked at her keenly, assessing her, she thought. He seemed to be trying to make up his mind about something. Nobody survives the yard, he added softly, almost to himself. As he said it, Evelyn felt a cold hand wrap around her heart. So, he said, it's up to us to do something about it. Evelyn looked at him, hope rising inside her as he spoke those last words. Exactly what sort of thing do you have in mind? She asked slowly, hoping against hope that she was judging this conversation correctly. Iraq paused for a second or two, then decided, irrevocably, to commit himself. You're going to escape, he said finally. You're taking him with you, and I'm helping you do it.